The sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving a blanket of purple and gold across the sky. Capricorn stood at the edge of the forest, her breath slow and deep, savoring the quiet. The world felt still, as if time itself had paused. She had come here to escape. The weight of the day, the endless demands, had pulled her away from the noise and into the solace of the trees. The breeze rustled the leaves above, a gentle whisper. It was a soft sound, comforting and familiar. But as she walked further into the woods, something felt off. Her boots crunched against the dry leaves, but the air around her seemed heavier, thicker. Each step felt like it took a little more effort. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the chills sank deep into her skin, like cold fingers brushing against her spine. It wasn't just the shift in temperature. It was as though the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet. Capricorn paused, eyes scanning the trees. A strange stillness had fallen over the forest. The usual rustling of small creatures, the songs of birds, the hum of life gone. Her pulse quickened, her senses on high alert. The wind had stopped. No birds called out from the branches. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for something. Capricorn felt a tremor in her chest, a deep, inexplicable unease. She took another step, and suddenly, crack! A branch snapped behind her. She spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing. Only the dense, shadowed woods. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. But her senses screamed at her to move. The air seemed to close in, pressing against her skin. She took a few cautious steps back, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of life. Any movement. Nothing. She could hear her own breathing now, louder than the silence that enveloped her. A soft rustle in the leaves caught her attention. Her gaze snapped to the ground. A small, white flower, delicate and pure, lay nestled among the fallen leaves. She knelt to inspect it, her fingers brushing the petals, soft as velvet. A strange warmth spread from her fingertips, a sudden rush of heat. She pulled her hand back quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The sensation lingered in her fingers, spreading through her arms, a pulse of energy. Before she could react, the world around her seemed to shift. The trees, tall and solid just moments before, swayed unnaturally, leaning toward her. The shadows between them stretched and twisted, like dark hands reaching for her. Her throat tightened, a rush of panic rising within her. She turned quickly, ready to run, but the forest seemed to close in, the path she'd walked vanishing behind her as though the earth itself had swallowed it up. Every direction she turned, the trees loomed closer, their branches swaying, no longer just part of the breeze, but moving with a sinister purpose. A crackling sound broke the silence, and Capricorn froze. In the distance, through the trees, she saw it, a figure, shrouded in shadow, moving toward her. Her heart skipped a beat. The air was thick with tension, her senses screaming for her to leave. But the figure was drawing closer, a figure that seemed impossibly tall. Its silhouette stretched like a darkened tower against the fading light. Capricorn's breath hitched, her legs frozen in place. The figure stopped, standing at the edge of the trees, its face hidden in the darkness. A chill washed over her as the temperature dropped even further. She could hear the faint rustling of the leaves underfoot. But this time it wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something purposeful. She blinked, and in that instant, the figure vanished. The forest seemed to hold its breath again. And for a moment, Capricorn wondered if it had all been a trick of the mind. But then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She stumbled, her knees buckling as the earth crumbled beneath her. For a split second, she caught a glimpse of something in the shadows, something dark, swirling, reaching up toward her. The last thing she heard was her own breath, sharp and ragged, as the world around her tilted into nothingness. The ground continued to shift beneath her, crumbling and breaking apart like fragile clay. Her body lurched forward, her hands scraping against the dirt as she tried desperately to catch herself. The air around her grew heavy, thick with an energy she couldn't explain. Her fingers grasped the earth, pulling herself up just in time to stop her fall. But the moment she found her balance, the shadows around her began to stretch again, longer this time, twisting in unnatural spirals, as though they were alive. The trees, once towering and still, now leaned toward her with an almost predatory air. Their bark appeared to ripple, as though some force was pushing from within. Capricorn's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of their gaze. The darkness around her thickened, pressing in, drowning her in a suffocating silence. A strange pressure built in her chest, as if something unseen was pulling at her heart, tugging it deeper into the forest. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, but there was no escape. Suddenly, the whispers began. Low and faint at first, like the wind carrying distant voices. But then they grew louder, clearer, as though 1,000 voices were murmuring in her ear. The language was foreign, a hissing, slithering rhythm that seemed to scrape at the very edges of her mind. Capricorn staggered back, her head spinning. She couldn't understand the words, but she felt their weight, their intent. The voices were coming from everywhere. From the trees, from the earth, from the air. The shadows around her grew even darker, coiling like serpents, until they seemed to swallow the very light. And then the figure appeared again. This time it was not in the distance. It was right in front of her. Capricorn froze. Nothing. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form obscured, heavy, suffocating presence. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto hers, and she could see by the darkness. But she could feel its presence. Beyond them. Just endless, black voids. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears, and her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The figure moved slowly, its silhouette shifting with each step, its form undulating like smoke. It reached out, and Capricorn could feel the air around her vibrate with the intensity of its movement. Her limbs felt numb, as though they were no longer her own, as though she were being pulled into a trance. Her body was frozen, her mind screaming to run, to move, but no sound came from her lips. The figure's hand reached forward. Its fingers, elongated and sharp, brushed against her cheek. The touch was cold. Too cold. Capricorn gasped, her body jerking with a sudden surge of panic. She tried to pull away, but the figure's hand followed her, closing around her wrist with an iron grip. The shadows seemed to swirl around them both now, as though the very forest had become one vast, unblinking eye. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was slipping, shifting, falling deeper into the abyss. She could feel her legs trembling, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. But the figure didn't let go. It was pulling her closer, its presence swallowing her whole. And then the whispers grew louder still. They were no longer just voices. They were screams. The sound rose in pitch, as if the forest itself were crying out in agony. Capricorn could hear her own name among them, distorted and hollow, echoing through the trees. Her vision blurred, the world spinning around her as the shadows closed in. The darkness pressed against her chest, suffocating, crushing. She felt as though the very air had become a part of the nightmare. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers digging into her skin. She could no longer breathe, no longer move. The shadows were everywhere now, drowning her in their depth. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The figure, the whispers, the darkening shadows gone. She was alone again, standing in the middle of the forest, her heart racing, her body trembling from the shock. Capricorn stood frozen, unsure if what had happened was real or just a twisted dream. The forest around her seemed untouched still. The air was thick, but no longer suffocating. She could feel the faint pulse in her fingers where the figure had touched her, the cold still lingering there. But there was no sign of the shadows, no figure in the distance. It was as if the forest had returned to normal. But the unease remained, deep within her chest, a cold knot that wouldn't loosen. Capricorn stood still, the eerie quiet of the forest pressing in on her from all sides. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air heavy and damp. The warmth that had once clung to her skin was gone, replaced by a coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She didn't trust the stillness. Every twig that snapped, every rustle of the leaves, made her heart race, her senses alert. But there was nothing except the forest, stretching endlessly before her. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself had been shaken. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes darting around. The path she had followed seemed unfamiliar now, twisted, as though it had been altered while she wasn't looking. She could still feel the lingering touch of the figure's icy fingers on her wrist. A shiver ran down her spine as she tried to steady herself. It wasn't just the figure, it was something far more unsettling. The energy of the forest, once so familiar, now felt alien, hostile. The trees, their bark seemingly alive with strange patterns, seemed to stare at her, watching her every move. A strange sense of urgency settled over her. She had to leave. She needed to get out of this place, back to something that felt real. But no matter how much she willed her legs to move, they remained frozen in place, her body unwilling to obey. Then, without warning, a distant cry broke through the silence. The sound was sharp, primal, a wail, like that of a creature in pain. Capricorn's eyes widened, her body stiffening with fear. It came from deeper within the forest, echoing through the trees. Her heart pounded harder, faster. She knew she had to follow it. But a part of her, deep inside, screamed not to go. Yet, she found herself walking, her feet carrying her toward the source of the cry. Every instinct within her screamed to turn back, to flee, but the pull was too strong. The deeper she walked, the darker the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted limbs reaching out as if trying to grasp at her. The shadows grew darker, thicker, and the air grew colder still. She pushed forward, the sound of her footsteps the only thing keeping her tethered to the world of the living. Another cry rang out, closer now. Capricorn's eyes darted toward the source, but the trees blocked her view. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as a strange unease washed over her, filling her mind with images of things she couldn't understand. A flicker of movement caught her attention. Something shifted in the corner of her vision, too fast for her to fully process, but undeniable. She whipped her head around, heart in her throat. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the figure again, standing just beyond the trees, watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. The cry came again, louder this time, closer. Capricorn's legs trembled beneath her as she pushed forward, the urge to turn and run growing with every step. She needed to know what it was, needed to understand why the forest felt so wrong, so alive. And then she saw it. A clearing ahead, bathed in an unnatural light. The trees parted, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. At the center of the clearing stood a pool of water, its surface still and black, reflecting the twisted shapes of the trees above. But it wasn't the pool that caught her attention, it was the figure kneeling beside it. The figure was tall, its back arched in a grotesque, unnatural way. Its limbs were long, too long, and its hands seemed to scrape the earth as it moved. Capricorn froze. The figure's face was hidden, obscured by a mass of tangled hair that seemed to move on its own, as if it had a life of its own. The figure's head turned slowly, impossibly, until its eyes, glowing faintly like embers, locked onto hers. A chill ran through her entire body, and she realized with horror that it wasn't the same figure she had seen earlier. This one was different. The creature's lips parted, but instead of sound, a strange, low hum emanated from it, sickening and deep, vibrating in the air. The hum seemed to reach inside her chest, stirring something ancient and primal. Her body screamed to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. The creature's eyes never left her as it stood, its movements slow and deliberate, its elongated limbs twitching as if testing the air. Capricorn could feel her heart pounding in her throat, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. She took a step back. The creature's head tilted, as though intrigued. And then it stepped forward. Each movement it made was fluid, almost hypnotic, but there was something distinctly wrong about it, like watching a marionette dance without strings. The figure's limbs stretched unnaturally, its joints cracking and popping as it moved. Capricorn's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape, but she was rooted to the spot. The creature was getting closer. Closer. The air around her thickened, pressing against her chest, suffocating, as though the very forest had become a living, breathing entity. Each step the creature took seemed to make the world pulse with an unnerving rhythm, as if the earth itself was responding to its movements. Capricorn could feel her heartbeat in her ears, drowning out everything else, but her body remained paralyzed. The creature's eyes, those glowing embers, never blinked. They locked onto hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was no longer a distant figure. No longer something out of the corner of her eye. It was here. And it was coming closer. Capricorn wanted to scream, to run, but her throat felt tight, her limbs like stone. She could only watch as the creature's gnarled fingers twitched, reaching for her. Its movements were deliberate, each one like a predator closing in on its prey. Its long, skeletal arms seemed to stretch impossibly, and for a split second, she thought it might tear itself apart. But it didn't. It was perfectly controlled. A low, vibrating hum filled the clearing again, like an insect buzzing too close to her ear. The creature's lips parted, but this time, the hum morphed into something that sounded almost like a voice, low and gravelly, yet unmistakably human. "You're here," it whispered, and its voice felt like it was crawling into her mind, like a chill seeping into her thoughts. "You've always been here." Capricorn's breath caught in her throat. The words reverberated within her, and a terrifying realization settled into her bones. It knew her. It knew her. The creature took another step, and this time, Capricorn couldn't stop herself. She stumbled backward, her feet finding the ground beneath her, but it was too late. She had moved into the center of the clearing, and she was trapped. The trees that had once lined the clearing seemed to close in behind her, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking her path. The creature was so close now she could feel its presence, a cold aura that wrapped around her, pressing her deeper into the earth. She could smell something metallic in the air, sharp and sickening, like old iron. The hum of the creature's voice had grown louder, filling the space around them until it felt like it was vibrating through her bones. Its fingers reached out, hovering just inches from her cheek, and Capricorn flinched, her body trembling uncontrollably. But no matter how hard she tried to move, to break free, she couldn't. "Why?" Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The creature's eyes flickered, its lips curling into a twisted, mocking smile. It didn't answer. Instead, its fingers hovered closer, brushing against her skin with an almost tender touch. The coldness of it burned into her, spreading like ice through her veins. In that moment, the world seemed to spin, the edges of her vision darkening. She could no longer tell if it was the creature's touch that was making her dizzy, or if it was something far deeper, something ancient, pulling at her soul. The creature's hum grew louder, almost deafening now, filling her mind with a sense of dread so deep it was as if the very core of her being was being torn apart. The shadows around them thickened, coiling like serpents, and Capricorn could feel herself sinking into them, being consumed by their weight. The sensation of the earth beneath her seemed to melt away, as though she were no longer standing on solid ground. And then, with a sudden burst of clarity, Capricorn felt something she hadn't before. A shift. The shadows, the weight, the pressure, they were all connected. They were all part of the same force that now surrounded her. The creature's eyes flickered again. Its smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the pale light. Capricorn's breath hitched, her mind screaming. This wasn't just a creature, it was a part of something far darker, far more ancient than she could comprehend. She had made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. And now there was no escape. No way to free herself from the tightening grip of the shadows closing in around her. The creature took one final step forward, its hand hovering just above her chest, and Capricorn felt the world begin to crumble once again, as if everything she had ever known was slipping away into the abyss. The clearing faded. The trees vanished. And all that remained was the cold, dark presence of the creature, its eyes glowing brighter than ever before. Her scream was lost to the endless void that swallowed her whole. The void was an oppressive silence, crushing and endless. Capricorn felt her body suspended in the dark, weightless and yet pinned by a force she could not see. Her mind was tangled in chaos, unable to comprehend the swirling darkness that surrounded her. There was no ground beneath her, no sky above. It was as if she had ceased to exist in the world she once knew. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. The cold had spread, consuming her completely, until she felt as though she were made of ice, frozen in a place where nothing mattered. And then, slowly, the figure reappeared. It was no longer just a presence. It had taken shape again, standing before her. The creature's glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, pulling her gaze, locking her in place with their unnatural intensity. It was the same figure, the same twisted form, but it felt different now. Closer, stronger. Its presence felt as if it had always been here, woven into the very fabric of this place. Capricorn couldn't look away. She could feel its power pressing in on her, invading her thoughts, her memories. It was as if the creature was inside her head, scraping through the depths of her mind, digging into her most vulnerable corners. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the pressure was overwhelming. The weight of its gaze was like an iron chain wrapped around her soul. "Do you feel it?" The creature's voice whispered, its tone both hypnotic and chilling. "This heaviness, this darkness, it's yours now." Capricorn's heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure took a step closer, its form growing ever more tangible. Its arms stretched forward, reaching toward her. She could feel the cold emanating from its hands, the same freezing sensation that had filled her when it first touched her. But this time, there was no escaping it. The touch would consume her, pull her deeper into the void where she couldn't escape. "Why?" she finally managed to rasp, her voice weak and broken. "Why me?" The creature tilted its head, its dark smile widening as it knelt before her. The darkness around them seemed to bend, folding inward as if it were alive, gathering closer, drawing its energy from her. "Because you are already part of it," the figure murmured. "You always have been." The words struck her like a blow to the chest. Capricorn's mind raced, trying to make sense of what the creature was saying. Part of it? She had never asked for this. She had never asked to be in this twisted forest, to be pulled into this nightmare. But deep down, a chilling thought whispered at the back of her mind. Hadn't she always felt something was off? A weight in her chest she could never explain? A sensation that there was something more to her existence, something dark, pulling at her from within? The quiet, persistent whispers of doubt that echoed from time to time? Her breath hitched. Was this what it had all been leading to? The creature's smile stretched wider, its fingers moving closer to her, almost tenderly, like it was about to stroke her cheek. But she couldn't move. She couldn't do anything but watch, helpless, as it closed the distance between them. And then, just as its icy fingers grazed her skin, the darkness shifted. For the briefest moment, the clearing seemed to fracture, like shattered glass, and the world around her flickered. She could see the trees again, the real ones. The path she had walked earlier. The sounds of the forest returned in a rush, distant but familiar. The warmth of the air began to return, and with it, a fleeting sense of reality. It wasn't over. Something in Capricorn fought, something deep within her that she didn't even realize was there. It was a flicker of defiance, a desperate wish to escape. She was more than this, more than the shadows, more than this creature. And as quickly as it had all descended into nightmare, the world began to shift. The darkness that had pulled her in began to recede, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The creature's form wavered, its glowing eyes fading. It screeched, a sound of fury, but it was powerless against the surge of light that now enveloped her. Capricorn's heart raced as the shadows parted, giving way to the warmth of the forest. She was no longer trapped in the void. But even as the creature faded into nothingness, the weight of its presence remained. And Capricorn knew that she had only just begun to understand the true depth of the darkness within. The forest around Capricorn began to shift once more, though not with the same suffocating force as before. The shadows retreated, leaving behind the faintest trace of their presence, an eerie whisper in the wind, like a reminder that they were never truly gone. Capricorn stood in the clearing, her body trembling, every fiber of her being on edge. Her chest heaved with each breath as she looked around. The trees had returned to their stillness, but something had changed. They seemed more alive, more watchful than ever before. She took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath her feet firm, solid. Her legs shook, but the urge to move was overwhelming. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, in this place where the lines between reality and nightmare had blurred so completely. Yet, with every step she took, the feeling that something was watching her, waiting, grew stronger. The whisper of the wind seemed to echo with faint words, murmurs she couldn't quite understand. Her eyes darted to the trees, to the corners of the clearing, expecting the creature to return at any moment. But there was nothing. Still, the weight in her chest remained. A tightness, a gnawing sensation that refused to leave. It was as if the darkness had imprinted itself on her very soul, leaving behind an indelible mark she could not erase. She paused, closing her eyes for a brief moment, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. She needed to focus. She needed to find her way back. And yet, as she opened her eyes, she saw something in the distance, something that had not been there before. A fig. It stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, its outline faint, like a shadow made of smoke. Capricorn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized it immediately, even though it seemed to flicker and distort as if it was made of the same darkness that had tried to consume her. It was the same figure. But this time, it didn't approach her. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, watching her, its glowing eyes gleaming faintly from within the shifting mass of shadow. Capricorn felt the same chill creep up her spine. The air around her thickened again, but this time it wasn't the creature pulling at her. This time, it was something else. Something far more insidious. The figure's lips curled into a smile, wide and malevolent. It was the same twisted, mocking smile that had chilled her to the core before. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the pull again, that overwhelming weight pushing her closer to it, drawing her into its orbit. But she had learned something in the moments before, the darkness, the creature. It was not just a force to be feared. It was part of her now, part of the fabric of her existence. The fear, the power, the weight, it all coursed through her veins like a dark river. She could feel it. She could feel it, the power, the potential to control it, to command the shadows instead of being consumed by them. But it was a dangerous path, one she had barely begun to understand. The figure continued to smile, but Capricorn didn't feel the same overwhelming sense of helplessness. She stood tall, her pulse steadying as a new feeling filled her, one of recognition, of knowing. She stepped forward, toward the figure, her movements slow but deliberate. The air around her shimmered with the energy she had only just begun to tap into. The figure's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing. It wasn't expecting this. Capricorn's voice, quiet but resolute, broke the silence. "You can't control me anymore." For a moment, the clearing was still. The trees, the wind, even the very shadows seemed to pause, waiting. Then the figure's form rippled, distorting and twisting in ways that defied logic. The shadows around it recoiled, as if repelled by her words. Capricorn stepped closer, her hand outstretched, not in fear, but in power. She could feel the pulse of the darkness in the air, responding to her. She could feel it bending, shifting, swirling around her like smoke. The figure shrieked, a high, guttural sound that vibrated the very air. It tried to retreat, to dissolve into the shadows, but Capricorn was no longer just the prey. She was the hunter. The shadows retreated before her, dissipating into the air as the figure shrank, its form no longer solid, no longer terrifying. In that moment, Capricorn understood. The darkness she had feared, the creature that had haunted her every step, was not an outside force to be conquered. It was a part of her, a reflection of the shadow within. And now she held the power to control it. As the last remnants of the figure disappeared into the ether, Capricorn stood in the clearing, the night air finally calm. The forest, too, seemed to breathe easier now, the oppressive weight lifting. But deep within her, she knew that this was just the beginning. The power she had felt, the connection to something deeper, darker, was still there. And whether she chose to embrace it or fight it would determine the path she walked from here on out. And so, Capricorn walked on, her steps steady and sure, knowing that the shadows would always be with her, but now, they were hers to command. Capricorn moved through the forest with a newfound purpose. The trees seemed to part before her, as though recognizing her transformation, acknowledging the power she now wielded. The path ahead was no longer shrouded in uncertainty. It was clear, illuminated by an inner light she hadn't known she possessed. The darkness still lingered, but now it felt less like a threat and more like an ally, something she could harness, shape, bend to her will. With each step, she felt stronger. The power she had once feared pulsed through her veins like a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that matched her own. It was strange, exhilarating, and at the same time unsettling. She was no longer the same Capricorn who had wandered into this forest, lost and desperate for escape. The air, once thick with unease, now felt strangely calm, as though the world itself had exhaled. But there was still an undercurrent, a hum that reverberated just beneath the surface. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She glanced around. The shadows seemed to watch her with a sense of curiosity, as though they were aware of the change in her. The trees, their twisted forms, no longer seemed threatening. They had become a part of her, their gnarled limbs no different than the darkness she had embraced within herself. She could feel their whispers in the wind, a language only she understood now. As she walked deeper into the forest, the sky overhead shifted. The stars above twinkled with a quiet intensity, their light mingling with the shadow that surrounded her. It was as if the very universe had aligned with her new understanding of herself. Yet, despite the calm, Capricorn knew that this was far from over. The creature, the one that had haunted her, was gone, but the path she had chosen was still fraught with uncertainty. The darkness was part of her now, yes, but it wasn't something that could be controlled so easily. She had tasted its power, felt its pull, and it had left a mark on her that could never be erased. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the distance. Something was out there, hidden just beyond her reach, yet close enough to feel. She paused, her senses sharpening, the air thickening with tension. The shadows seemed to bend toward her, drawn by the same force that had brought her here. She squinted, her eyes narrowing. A figure, dark and indistinct, stood in the distance, just at the edge of her vision. It was too far to make out any details, but there was no mistaking its presence. It was someone, waiting for her. A part of her wanted to retreat, to turn away, to let the shadows protect her. But another part, the part that had embraced this new power, pushed her forward. She couldn't run from what was coming. She had already faced the darkness once before. Now she would face it. It again. With steady resolve, Capricorn took a step toward the figure. As she did, the world around her seemed to shift again. The trees loomed taller, their twisted forms leaning in closer, the shadows deepening. The figure remained motionless, its presence heavy in the air, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for her. Capricorn stopped, just at the edge of the clearing where the figure stood. She could feel its gaze on her, even though she could not yet see its face. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could sense that this moment was different from the last. The darkness she had faced before had been an external force, something outside of her. But this was something else entirely. A low, rumbling hum filled the air, not unlike the one she had heard before. But this time, it was not the creature's voice. No, this hum was different. It was a call, a summons, a connection. The figure shifted, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. It was not threatening, at least, not in the way the creature had been, but there was an undeniable sense of power in its movements. As it drew closer, Capricorn could finally see its form more clearly. It was not human, not in the way she had expected. Its shape was fluid, shifting in the dim light, its form both solid and intangible at once. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie light that had once filled the creature's gaze, but now they were calm, steady, like an ancient force observing her. "You have changed," a voice said, deep and resonant, echoing in her mind. Capricorn's heart skipped a beat. She knew the voice, even if she had never heard it spoken aloud. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the darkness that had once sought to consume her. And now it was speaking to her, acknowledging her transformation. "I have," she replied, her voice steady, though a part of her still trembled. The figure came closer, its presence overwhelming yet not entirely hostile. It stood before her now, its form coalescing into something more defined, though still shifting. There was a moment of silence before the figure spoke again. "You have embraced what was always yours. The shadows. The power that lies beneath. But there is more to this path than you realize." Capricorn's gaze never wavered. "What do you mean?" The figure's eyes flickered with an almost imperceptible glow. "The darkness is not simply a force to control. It is a part of the world. A part of you. But there are those who will seek to wield it for their own ends. To corrupt it." A chill ran through her. She understood. The power she had claimed, the darkness she had embraced, it was not just for her. There would be others who would come. Others who would want it. "You are not alone in this," the figure whispered. "But you must decide where your loyalty lies." Capricorn stood in the silence, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: her journey had only just begun. Capricorn stood in the presence of the figure, her mind swirling with its cryptic words. The weight of the decision it implied felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. She was no longer just a wanderer in the forest. She was a force, a part of something far larger than herself. The figure's gaze never left her, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, as though it were searching her soul. The darkness around them hummed with energy, the shadows themselves seeming to lean in, awaiting her response. "I don't understand," Capricorn finally whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "What is it that you're asking me to choose?" The figure's form shifted again, more fluid now, as though its very essence was made of smoke and night. "You are the bridge between two worlds," it said, its voice like a low melody. "The world of light and the world of darkness. You walk both, but you are not of either. Your choice will decide the balance. Will you remain in the shadows, content to control them? Or will you push forward, bring the balance to the world of light, to restore harmony?" Capricorn felt her heart race, her thoughts clashing against one another. The idea of wielding this power, of shaping the shadows into something that could bend to her will, was intoxicating. She had tasted that power, felt it flow through her like a second heartbeat. But the thought of using it to disturb the balance of the world, of harming others in pursuit of this potential, it left a bitter taste in her mouth. The figure seemed to sense her hesitation, its form rippling as if trying to comfort her. "The darkness does not have to be destructive," it murmured, its voice softer now. "It is a part of the natural world, like the night is to the day. The two must coexist. But you must decide how you wish to live with it. Will you use it to hide, to protect yourself, or will you use it to shape the world?" Capricorn took a slow breath, the gravity of the moment sinking deeper into her bones. She had always felt different, like there was something beneath the surface of her life that called to her, a hidden power she couldn't explain. The shadows she had feared now felt like a part of her, a part of her strength. Yet, this power had consequences. She couldn't ignore that. Her mind flashed back to the moment when the creature had almost consumed her, when the forest had been nothing but cold, alien terror, and she had been completely powerless. That fear still clung to her. She didn't want to fall prey to that again. But she also knew that the answer to her fear wasn't to run from it, or to hide in the light. She had to accept what was in front of her. She turned her gaze back to the figure, the swirling darkness of its form seeming to pulse with expectation. "I want to bring balance," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I want to learn to control it, this power, but not to destroy, not to harm. I want to live with it, not be consumed by it." The figure nodded slowly, its smoky form settling as it seemed to process her words. It tilted its head, the glow of its eyes dimming slightly, as though approving her decision. "Balance," it whispered. "That is the true path." For a long moment, they stood there, the forest around them still, the shadows retreating, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. Couldn't explain. It wasn't the coldness of fear, it was the chill of understanding, of power shared between two forces. The connection between them seemed to vibrate in the air. "You will learn," the figure said softly, its voice like a lullaby. "You will learn how to walk between the worlds, how to wield the shadows without being consumed by them." As the figure spoke, Capricorn felt the power in her, felt it swirling beneath the surface, ready to respond, to be shaped by her will. She could feel it now, not as an overwhelming force, but as a part of her, like the blood flowing through her veins. The shadows were no longer something to fear. They were simply a part of the world, a part of her. "You must go," the figure said, pulling its hand back. "There is much to be done. But remember, Capricorn, you are the keeper of this balance. The darkness will test you, as will the light. But your strength lies in how you choose to walk the path in between." Capricorn nodded, her heart steady, her mind clearer than it had ever been before. She understood now. The shadows were not enemies, they were a part of her, just as the light was. She could no longer ignore the darkness within her. It was as much a part of her identity as her strength, her courage, her will. With one final glance at the figure, which now seemed to dissolve back into the shadows, Capricorn took a deep breath and turned, walking back into the forest. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. The power, the balance, the shadows, they were all part of her journey now. And she would walk it with open eyes, no longer afraid, but ready. As she stepped deeper into the forest, the air around her seemed to hum, a quiet, comforting sound. The night had never felt so alive, and the world, both light and dark, was hers to explore. Capricorn walked deeper into the forest, each step feeling lighter than the last. The world around her seemed to pulse with new energy. The shadows, which had once been her fear, now felt like her companions, moving with her, flowing around her like a gentle breeze. The path ahead was uncertain, yet she didn't hesitate. She felt no need to rush, no anxiety pulling at her heart. The forest seemed to stretch before her, endless and full of possibility, and she knew that every step was taking her toward something new, toward the purpose she had only begun to understand. As she moved, the air grew cooler, but the chill didn't unsettle her. It was simply the night settling deeper into the world, its shadows stretching longer and longer as the stars above twinkled in a way that felt almost purposeful, as though they were watching her, guiding her. Capricorn's mind was full of everything she had learned, the truth about the darkness, the figure's words, the balance she now had to maintain. The power within her was still there, faint but steady, like a constant hum beneath the surface of her being. She could feel it, alive and waiting, but it was no longer something to be feared. It was something to learn from, to shape, to control. Yet, even with all this new understanding, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something more, something beyond the forest. The figure had spoken of the balance between light and dark, but Capricorn now realized there was so much more to it than she had first believed. There were other forces that would try to control the shadows, to twist them for their own ends. And that, she realized, was her true purpose, not just to walk the path between light and dark, but to protect that balance, to ensure that neither side tipped too far. The figure had spoken of others who would come. She didn't know who or what they were, but she knew one thing: they wouldn't stop until they found her. Until they found the power she now held. The wind picked up around her, rustling the leaves, and Capricorn's senses sharpened. She paused, her heart thudding in her chest as a figure stepped out from the shadows ahead. It wasn't like the figure from before. This presence felt more solid, more human. The silhouette was tall, cloaked, and its face was obscured in shadow, but Capricorn could feel its gaze, cold and calculating. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, watching her. Capricorn's body tensed, the familiar stir of unease rising in her chest, but she quickly squashed it down. The fear she had once felt was gone, replaced by something new. The shadow within her responded to the stranger's presence, a dark energy stirring at the back of her mind. "You're the one they've been waiting for," the figure said, its voice low and smooth, like silk against stone. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Unknowing, Capricorn stood tall, steady. "And who are you?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. The figure took a step forward, and the shadows around it seemed to bend, as if drawn to the figure's very being. "I'm someone who understands the darkness as you now do." There was an almost imperceptible pause before the figure continued. "You've changed, Capricorn. But do you truly know what that change means?" Capricorn's pulse quickened, her senses alert. "What do you want?" The figure took another step forward, closer now, and she could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on her. "I want you to understand the cost of your choices," it said, its voice barely above a whisper. "The shadows may be your ally now, but that doesn't mean they'll always be. They're a force, Capricorn. A force that can turn against you when you least expect it." The words felt like a warning, but Capricorn didn't flinch. She had come to terms with the shadows. She had accepted them into her life. But there was something unsettling about this figure, something ancient and wise in the way it spoke, as if it knew far more than it was willing to reveal. "I've made my choice," she replied, her voice steady, though her thoughts raced. "I control the shadows. They are part of me now. I won't let them control me. The figure smiled, though the expression was unreadable in the dark. You speak with certainty, it said. But we all have our limits. The shadows will test you, Capricorn. They'll pull at you, twist you, and before long, you'll wonder if you're truly the one in control. There's always a price to be paid. Capricorn felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. She had faced the darkness before and survived. This figure might know more, might be older, wiser, but she wasn't going to let it intimidate her. What do you want from me? She asked again, her voice sharper this time. The figure stepped even closer, and for the first time, Capricorn could see the outline of its face, pale, almost ghostly, with eyes that gleamed with an unnerving knowledge. I want you to understand that the power you hold is not without consequence, it said, its gaze locking with hers. You've made the first step toward understanding the darkness, but there is more. There's a cost to every choice, Capricorn. The balance you seek to protect, it will come at a price. Capricorn's heart pounded as the figure's words sank in. There was a price. She had known that deep down, but hearing it so clearly, so definitively, sent a jolt of fear through her. What price? What would she have to sacrifice to hold the balance? I'm not afraid of the cost, she said, though doubt lingered at the edges of her thoughts. I will protect the balance. The figure stepped back, its expression unreadable. We shall see, it murmured, almost to itself. And then, before Capricorn could say another word, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the rustling leaves and the echo of its words hanging heavy in the air. The wind died down, the forest settling into silence once more, but Capricorn's heart didn't calm. She was alone again, but the weight of what the figure had said pressed heavily upon her. The cost of the shadows. The price of power. Capricorn wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was clear, her journey had just taken a darker turn. Capricorn stood in the stillness of the forest, her heart racing. The figure's cryptic words echoed in her mind, swirling like a storm of uncertainty. The cost of the shadows, it had said. The price of power. What price? What sacrifice would she have to make? The question lingered, cold and unyielding, and she found herself unable to shake it. The shadows, once so comforting, now felt heavier, as though they were watching her, waiting. She couldn't quite place it, but there was a shift in the air, something palpable and unsettling. The wind had died down, but the trees seemed to sway more than they should have, as if moved by an unseen hand. The silence was thick, oppressive, and it felt as though the very earth was holding its breath. She glanced around, searching for any sign of the figure's return, but there was nothing. The forest stretched out before her, dark and endless. And yet, despite the calmness around her, Capricorn couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the shadows, something she couldn't see, but could feel in the depths of her bones. Her hand instinctively moved to the stone pendant hanging around her neck, the one she had found so long ago. It was warm against her skin, almost alive in the stillness. The pendant had been with her since she first stepped into this forest, its strange energy grounding her whenever doubt or fear crept in. Now, though, it pulsed with an unfamiliar intensity, as though it, too, was sensing the change in the air. With a deep breath, Capricorn began to walk again, her pace slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the silence. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but she couldn't stay in one place, not with the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. The shadows seemed to move around her, twisting and bending in strange ways, as if they were alive and aware of her every move. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. It wasn't a tremor, but a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the earth, like the forest was shifting, reacting to her presence. She stopped, her senses heightened, and she looked down at the ground. The roots of the trees seemed to stretch toward her, their gnarled limbs twitching as though they were alive, responding to the energy that now flowed through her. Capricorn's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it, feel the pull of something deep beneath the earth. It was dark, raw, and ancient, and it was beckoning her. The shadows that had always felt like a part of her now seemed to reach deeper into the earth, calling to the darkness below. A low, resonant hum filled the air, like the vibration of a deep chord strummed in the earth itself. The sound was not a melody, but something primal, ancient. She felt it in her chest, vibrating through her ribs, as though it were resonating with her very soul. Instinctively, Capricorn took a step back. This was no longer just the quiet, familiar darkness she had come to know. This was something far more powerful, far older than anything she had encountered before. The shadows weren't just a tool for her to wield. They were a force, a presence, something far beyond her understanding. The humming grew louder, and the shadows began to shift around her, swirling and pulling toward the ground beneath her feet. Capricorn's heart began to race, her senses on edge. She knew she had to move, but something held her in place. The pull of the shadows, the pull of the earth below, was too strong, too all-encompassing. Then, without warning, the ground cracked open. A massive, jagged fissure split the earth in front of her, sending a shockwave through the forest. The shadows poured into the gap, swirling like smoke, rushing into the crack as though they were being drawn into a deep, dark abyss. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and Capricorn stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. From the depths of the crack, a dark figure emerged, rising from the earth itself. It was larger than anything she had seen before, towering and formless, a shadow of pure darkness. It had no face, no form. Capricorn froze, her breath caught in her throat. This was the darkness she had sensed, the one the figure had warned her about. It was more than just a force. It was a presence, an entity, something alive, something ancient and powerful. The figure moved toward her, its presence sending ripples through the air. It did not speak, but Capricorn could feel it, feel its gaze, its hunger, its desire to consume. It was drawn to her, to the power she now held, to the balance she had claimed. And it was not here to bargain. She felt the pull of its darkness, a call that she couldn't ignore. Her heart raced, and her hand instinctively reached for the pendant around her neck. It pulsed in her grip, its warmth spreading through her fingers, but it wasn't enough. The darkness surrounding her was too strong, too vast, too ancient. It was beyond her control, beyond anything she had ever faced. The figure loomed closer, its presence engulfing everything around her. The trees, the earth, the sky, it all seemed to fade into the background, as if the world were collapsing into the shadow before her. Capricorn's mind raced. She had faced the darkness before, but this was different. This was not something she could control. This was not something she could shape. This was the price of her choice, the cost of wielding the shadows, the cost of walking the line between light and dark. And now there was no turning back. Capricorn stood frozen, the weight of the dark figure pressing down on her like a crushing force. Her breath hitched in her chest, the air thick and heavy, as though every molecule was charged with an impending storm. The shadows stretched and swirled around her, their movement growing more erratic, more intense, as if they were drawn to the figure's presence, answering its call. The figure loomed over her, its form indistinct, a shifting void of pure darkness. Capricorn could feel its pull deep within her, like the gravity of a black hole that threatened to devour everything. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to retreat into the safety of the familiar, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. The shadows were no longer just a part of her, they were the very air she breathed, and this force before her, this ancient presence, was calling her in ways she couldn't escape. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, the fissure widening, as the darkness began to bleed from the earth, creeping toward her like a living thing. The air grew colder, and her vision blurred as the shadows swallowed the light around her. It felt as though time itself had slowed, and in that moment, the world shrank down to just her and the figure before her, locked in an eternal standoff. "You cannot hide from what you have become," the figure spoke, its voice not a sound but a feeling, a vibration that echoed through her bones. It was not an accusation, but a simple truth. The darkness was in her now. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. It was both a part of her and something separate, something ancient that had always been there, waiting for this moment. Capricorn's mind raced, the words of the figure from before coming back to her. "The shadows will test you. They'll pull at you, twist you, and before long, you'll wonder if you're truly the one in control." Was this the test? Was this the moment when the darkness would claim her, when it would consume her completely? She gripped the pendant tighter, its warmth a small comfort in the vast, cold expanse of shadow surrounding her. The energy in it pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. She had chosen this path. She had made this choice to walk the line between light and dark, and she couldn't allow herself to fall prey to the very force she had embraced. With a slow, deliberate movement, Capricorn lifted her chin and faced the figure, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear. She had to resist. The balance she sought wasn't just about controlling the shadows, it was about understanding them. She was not their servant, but their keeper. The darkness was not her enemy, but her challenge. "I control the shadows," she whispered, the words steady and unwavering. "I control them, not the other way around." The figure seemed to consider this for a moment, its shape flickering in and out, as if uncertain. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it began to move closer, its form swirling around her, the darkness wrapping tighter and tighter, pulling her deeper into its grip. But instead of fear, Capricorn felt a surge of power. The shadows weren't just around her, they were within her, part of her very essence. They could not consume her unless she allowed them to. With a deep breath, Capricorn closed her eyes and focused, reaching within herself, feeling the pull of the darkness beneath her skin. She felt the shadows shift, bending to her will, as she summoned them with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The pendant around her neck grew warmer, its energy swirling around her, strengthening her resolve. The shadows no longer felt alien, no longer felt like an outside force. It was her power, her choice, her command. The figure recoiled, its form shuddering, as though it had felt the change, the strength that now surged through her. The darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming, so all-encompassing, was now something she could control, something she could shape. She was no longer the passive participant in the dance of light and dark. She was the one who set the rhythm. With a swift, decisive movement, Capricorn raised her hand, and the shadows responded, twisting and shifting at her command. The darkness that had once seemed to encircle her now pulled back, retreating in the face of her strength. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifted, and the ground beneath her feet settled. The figure faltered, its form flickering, as if it wasn't sure how to react to her newfound power. "I control the balance," Capricorn said again, her voice stronger now, filled with a confidence she had never known before. "And I will protect it." The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through her, assessing, studying her every move. Then, with a soft, almost disappointed sigh, it began to fade, its form dissolving back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The darkness that had once seemed so terrifying now felt distant, no longer an insurmountable force, but a mere part of the natural world, something she could shape and understand. As the figure disappeared, the shadows retreated further into the forest, their whispers fading into silence. Capricorn stood alone in the clearing, the air still, the moonlight casting soft shadows across the ground. The tension that had filled the night seemed to ease, and the world around her felt peaceful, balanced. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the power within her settle into place, no longer a force of chaos, but a steady, grounding presence. The shadows were hers to command, but they would not consume her. She had learned to walk the line between light and dark, and she had found the strength to protect the balance she sought. With one final glance around the forest, Capricorn turned and began to walk once more, her steps light and sure. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now she faced it with clarity. The shadows, the light, the balance, these were hers to shape. And whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with the strength of both worlds within her. Capricorn's steps were steady now, each one more confident than the last. The eerie weight that had clung to the forest was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of life around her. The trees no longer felt oppressive, but rather like companions, their branches swaying gently in the cool night breeze. The shadows still clung to the ground, but they no longer whispered with unease. Now they were simply there, part of the landscape, silent and still. The balance was hers to uphold. The words echoed in her mind, a mantra she could rely on. She had come to understand that neither the light nor the dark could exist without the other, and neither could she exist without both. The shadows that had once threatened to consume her were now her allies, and her role was clear: to guard the equilibrium between them, to guide both forces into harmony. Still, there lingered a part of her, small but persistent, that couldn't entirely shake the chill she had felt when the figure had appeared. The figure hadn't been just a threat, it had been a warning, a reminder that darkness, even the kind she controlled, was never entirely safe. The figure had hinted at the price she would have to pay, and though Capricorn had stood firm, a lingering sense of unease crept beneath her skin. What did it truly mean to balance the forces of light and dark? Could she really keep them both at peace? And if she couldn't, what would become of her? She paused, her fingers once more brushing the pendant around her neck, its warmth now a comforting presence against the uncertainty that fluttered in her chest. The darkness, she reminded herself, was not an enemy, but that didn't mean it wouldn't test her. It was a force to be respected, to be understood. And as she continued walking through the forest, she could feel it, feel the very pulse of the shadows, as though they were alive, watching her, waiting for her next move. The forest began to feel less like a place of refuge and more like a stage, where she and the shadows were the actors in a play that had no end, no clear resolution. What had she been chosen for? Was it merely to keep the balance, or was there something more? A deeper purpose she had yet to uncover? She couldn't deny that part of her wanted to understand the full extent of the power that flowed through her, to fully grasp what it meant to control not just the shadows, but everything they touched. Ahead, the forest thinned, and the first hints of dawn's light began to paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Capricorn's senses sharpened. She had been walking for hours, lost in thought, but now, with the first light of day breaking through the trees, she felt the weight of the night lift. A new day was beginning. A new challenge awaited. As the light grew stronger, the shadows receded, revealing the world in full detail. The forest was beautiful, its trees towering with ancient wisdom, the ground soft beneath her feet, and the air rich with the scent of earth and pine. Yet even in the light, she could feel the pull of the darkness, lurking just beneath the surface, reminding her that she had only just begun to scratch the surface of the power she wielded. Capricorn stopped at the edge of a small stream, the water glistening in the morning sun. She knelt, dipping her fingers into the cool water, the chill sending a small shiver through her body. The contrast between the cold water and the warmth of the pendant was striking, a reminder of the duality she now carried within her. The water rippled, creating small waves that shimmered in the sunlight, and Capricorn watched, entranced by the play of light and shadow upon the surface. She thought back to the figure's words, the cost of the shadows. The balance had come at a price, yes, but the balance was also her responsibility. It was a duty she had accepted, and though the path ahead was unclear, she would not falter. The shadows might test her, the darkness might pull at her, but Capricorn now knew that she had the strength to hold her ground. She had chosen this journey, and she would see it through. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light across the land, Capricorn stood, the water still flowing gently by her side. The world seemed vast, full of possibility, and yet, for the first time, she felt a sense of peace within herself. The balance was in her hands, and she would protect it. Capricorn stood at the edge of the stream, watching the water flow gently past her. The rising sun bathed the forest in a warm, golden light, and for a moment, she simply breathed in the stillness around her. The air was crisp and clean, and the world seemed to hum with quiet life. Yet, beneath that peaceful surface, the shadows lingered, a constant reminder of the weight she now carried. She knew that balance wasn't something that could be maintained passively. It was a constant effort, a delicate dance between forces that could easily spiral out of control. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the balance she sought wasn't just about keeping the shadows in check. It was about understanding them, about accepting that they were a part of her, just as much as the light. Without one, the other could not exist. And if she could learn to embrace that, to understand the depths of both light and darkness within herself, then perhaps she could find the peace she had been searching for all along. The water's surface shimmered, and Capricorn gazed at her reflection, the image distorted by the ripples. Her face looked peaceful, but there was a new intensity in her eyes, a deeper understanding of who she was becoming. The shadows had tested her, had drawn her into their depths, but they hadn't consumed her. She was still here, standing at the crossroads of light and dark, and now, she was more in control than ever before. She could hear the distant rustle of the trees, the whisper of leaves in the morning breeze. There was no sign of the dark figure now, no sign of any other presence in the forest. The silence was comforting, but even in that stillness, Capricorn could feel the subtle pull of the shadows. It was as if they were calling to her, inviting her to return to their embrace. But this time, Capricorn didn't feel the same fear or uncertainty. She knew that she had the power to shape the shadows, to bend them to her will. She didn't need to flee from them. They were a part of her, And in that moment, she understood the true meaning of balance. She was no longer running from the darkness. She was embracing it. With one last glance at the flowing stream, Capricorn turned away and began to walk deeper into the forest. The shadows seemed to move with her, slipping through the trees, blending seamlessly into the morning light. She didn't resist their presence. Instead, she welcomed them, letting their dark tendrils weave around her like a cloak. They weren't enemies. They were guides, teachers, forces that would help her grow stronger, more attuned to the delicate balance of the world. As she walked, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air grew cooler, the shadows deeper, but Capricorn felt no unease. She was walking into the heart of the forest, into the heart of her journey. And she was ready. The path before her was still uncertain, but she knew now that she could face whatever lay ahead. The balance between light and dark would not always be easy to maintain, but she had learned something important in the stillness of the night and the rising of the dawn. The shadows were not to be feared. They were simply a part of the world, a part of herself, and as long as she understood that, she could hold the balance between them. The wind picked up again, but this time, it didn't feel unsettling. It felt like a whisper, like the forest itself was speaking to her, urging her forward. Capricorn took another step, her heart steady, her breath calm. The journey was just beginning. But now, she was no longer alone. The shadows were with her, a constant companion on her path, and with them, she felt a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, she would face it with strength, with clarity, and with the balance of light and dark within her. The shadows were hers to command, and they would never take control again. She was the keeper of the balance, and that was a power no force could ever break. As Capricorn ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, the shadows seemed to stretch with her every step, weaving through the trees like an ancient, living presence. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the sound of her footsteps on the soft ground was muffled by the growing quiet. Even the birds had stopped their singing, as if holding their breath, watching her as she walked with newfound purpose. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing taller, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like the hands of long-forgotten spirits. The sunlight, once gentle, was now little more than a faint glow filtering through the dense canopy above. The shadows were heavy, pressing in from all sides, and yet Capricorn felt no fear. She welcomed them, feeling them swirl and shift around her, a familiar presence that no longer threatened to overwhelm her. As she continued on, she began to notice subtle changes in the landscape, small, almost imperceptible shifts that caught her attention. The leaves on the trees seemed to glow faintly, as though imbued with a secret energy. The air felt heavier, more charged, as if something ancient was stirring beneath the surface of the forest. It was as though the shadows themselves were leading her somewhere, guiding her toward a destination she couldn't yet see. The path ahead twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step, until it became little more than a faint trail barely visible through the dense underbrush. Capricorn moved cautiously now, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, alive with a quiet rhythm, as though the forest itself was breathing. Then, as if the forest had suddenly parted before her, Capricorn came upon a clearing, a place so different from the rest of the forest that it felt almost otherworldly. The ground was smooth and flat, and in the center, a large stone altar stood, bathed in an eerie, dim light. The air around the altar hummed with an ancient energy, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within her, stirring something buried in her soul. The shadows around her began to swirl faster, drawn to the altar as if called by an unseen force. Capricorn stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the pendant at her neck. The stone was warm against her skin, pulsing gently, and as her fingers brushed it, she felt the flow of energy shift. The shadows reacted, moving in harmony with the pendant's pulse, as though they were bound to it, bound to her. The altar seemed to draw her closer, beckoning her to step forward, and despite every instinct telling her to hesitate, she couldn't resist. Something in the clearing called to her, something ancient and powerful, and she knew that it was time to face whatever lay ahead. As she stepped into the center of the clearing, the shadows thickened around her, swirling in chaotic patterns. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with life. The pendant grew even warmer, and Capricorn's heart began to race, as if she were standing on the precipice of something vast and unknown. And then, as though the world itself was holding its breath, a voice spoke, a deep, resonant voice that echoed not in her ears, but in her very soul. "Do you seek to command the darkness, child of the shadows?" the voice asked, a question that seemed both ancient and timeless. Capricorn froze, her body tense, but her mind clear. The question resonated within her, striking a deep chord. She had chosen this path. She had embraced the balance of light and dark, but now, the true weight of that choice was before her. The shadows had tested her, and she had passed their trials, but was she truly ready to bear the mantle of their keeper? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I seek to understand," she said, her voice unwavering. "I seek to protect the balance." The shadows around her seemed to quiet at her words, their movement slowing to a gentle swirl, as though considering her response. The voice spoke again, this time with a soft, almost approving tone. "Then you must face the depths of the darkness," it said. "To understand the balance, you must first know the true cost of power. You must walk the path of the shadows, and only then will you understand your place in the world." The air grew colder, the shadows pressing in closer. Capricorn felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her, but she stood firm. She had come this far. She had embraced both the light and the dark. Now, she would face whatever came next, whatever the shadows demanded of her. The ground beneath her feet trembled once more, and she felt the earth pulse with power. The shadows grew thicker, swirling around her like a storm, and in the center of it all, the altar seemed to glow with an unearthly light. Capricorn's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the altar, the whispers of the shadows growing louder, their voices melding into a cacophony of ancient, forgotten words. And then, in the heart of the storm, she saw it, a vision, a glimpse of something far beyond what she had known. The shadows parted, and she saw herself, standing at the center of the world, holding the balance between light and dark, between creation and destruction. The weight of the responsibility was immense, but there was no fear, only understanding. Capricorn took one final step forward, her heart filled with determination. She was ready. She would face the shadows, embrace the power within her, and protect the balance that the world so desperately needed. The vision faded, and the shadows settled. The storm within her ceased, leaving a profound stillness in its wake. And for the first time, Capricorn understood. She wasn't just the keeper of the shadows. She was their protector, their guide, and their balance. And with that understanding, she was ready to walk her path, whatever it may hold. The stillness in the clearing settled like a soft cloak, wrapping around Capricorn. Her breath slowed, and the air that had once felt thick and oppressive now felt open, almost serene. The vision she had glimpsed of herself as the keeper of balance, a protector between light and dark, lingered in her mind, vivid and clear. It was not just a path she had to walk. It was a role she had been destined for, one that came with both power and responsibility. She stood in the center of the clearing, the shadows around her now calm, as if they had accepted her newfound understanding. They no longer pressed in, suffocating and chaotic. Instead, they danced gently at the edges of her vision, waiting, watching. With a quiet breath, Capricorn turned away from the altar. The path ahead of her was still veiled in mystery, but the uncertainty no longer unsettled her. Her heart was steady, and her purpose clear. The shadows, once seen as her adversaries, were now an integral part of her existence, and she was beginning to understand them in ways she never had before. As she moved back toward the forest's edge, the trees seemed to part for her, their branches shifting aside like old friends who recognized her. The soft rustle of leaves was now a gentle song, a hymn to her journey. Every step felt like a step closer to something greater, something she hadn't yet fully realized but knew was awaiting her just beyond the horizon. The sun had fully risen, its light no longer filtering through the trees, but bathing the world in its bright, unyielding glow. The shadows, which had seemed so dominant in the night, now appeared subdued under the sun's touch, but Capricorn could feel them still, a presence in the corner of her mind, always with her. She was no longer afraid of them. They were a part of her, as much a part of her as the warmth of the sun on her skin. Her thoughts turned to the future. What would she do with this power she had claimed? What challenges would test her next? The voice in the clearing had warned her of the true cost of power, and though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, Capricorn was not afraid. She had faced the shadows.
She had learned from them.
And now, she would walk forward with the strength of that knowledge. But the journey wasn't over. She felt that deep within her, there were still lessons to be learned, still mysteries to uncover. The balance between light and dark wasn't something she would ever truly master. It was a constant, shifting force, and she would have to adapt with every step she took. But that was her role, her gift. To protect the balance, to ensure that neither the light nor the dark overwhelmed the other. With every step, the shadows followed her, not as a threat, but as companions on her journey. They were no longer something to be controlled. They were something to be understood, something to walk with. Capricorn paused, her eyes gazing toward the distant horizon. There was a glimmer of something new there, something that called to her a new challenge, a new mystery to unravel. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it in the air, like a whisper on the wind. It was waiting for her. She knew now that she was ready. The path before her might twist and turn in ways she couldn't predict, but she had the strength to face it. She was the keeper of the balance between light and dark, and whatever came next, she would walk it with courage, wisdom, and the quiet strength of the shadows. And with that, Capricorn continued on her journey, stepping forward into the world with the shadows at her side and the light within her guiding the way. The balance was hers to uphold, and no force, no matter how powerful, could take that from her. She had found her place in the world, and now she was ready to protect it. The forest, now bathed in the soft light of early evening, stood still, as though holding its breath. The shadows had grown longer, creeping across the forest floor, yet they seemed different now, less threatening, more patient. Capricorn moved through the trees with a newfound grace, the weight of her journey not an encumbrance, but a reminder of her purpose. She had come to understand that the balance between light and dark was not a static state. It was a living, breathing force, one that ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of the world itself. And she was its keeper. The thought did not burden her as it once had. No longer did the shadows feel like enemies she had to suppress or control. They were simply a part of her, a part of the world, and the light was no less important in its constant dance with them. As the evening air grew cooler, a distant sound broke the silence, a soft rustle, followed by a sudden, sharp crack of a branch. Capricorn's senses sharpened. The shadows around her seemed to stir, as if drawn to the disturbance. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. The balance she had worked so hard to maintain was about to be tested again. Her steps were steady as she approached the source of the sound. She moved deeper into the forest, where the trees grew even thicker, their twisted roots rising like ancient sentinels. The air felt heavy, charged with energy. She could feel it, the pull of something unfamiliar, something darker, yet not entirely threatening. The path narrowed, and at the end, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of a small clearing. The figure was cloaked, its face hidden in shadow. There was something familiar about it, something she couldn't quite place. And yet, she didn't need to know who or what it was. The presence before her was a test, a reminder that the shadows were never truly quiet, never still for long. The figure turned slightly, as if aware of her approach. The world around them seemed to pause, as though time itself was holding its breath. Capricorn, the voice whispered, deep and knowing, "You've come far, but are you ready for what comes next?" Capricorn didn't flinch. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, met the figure's shadowed form. "I am," she said quietly, a sense of peace settling over her. The figure nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of its mouth. "Then you understand the cost of the balance." The shadows deepened around them, swirling like a storm waiting to break. Capricorn knew now. The balance wasn't a prize to be won, nor a battle to be fought. It was an endless dance, one she would never stop learning, never stop guiding. And as the figure began to fade into the shadows, its voice lingering like a whisper, Capricorn stood tall. The path ahead was uncertain, but she had no fear. The shadows were no longer something to be feared. They were part of her, and she was ready to walk alongside them, wherever they led. The forest closed around her once more, but this time it felt like home. The last rays of the setting sun filtered through the dense canopy of the forest, casting a soft, amber glow over the path ahead. Capricorn paused, her footsteps halting as she looked around the forest that had both tested and shaped her. The shadows no longer felt like an unknown threat. They were familiar, comforting, even. The trees around her, once towering figures of uncertainty, now felt like old friends, their branches arching overhead like protectors. For a long time, Capricorn had wandered between the worlds of light and dark, caught between two forces that had seemed so vastly different. She had feared the shadows, resisted their pull. But now, in the quiet of the evening, she understood them for what they truly were, part of the natural order, just as necessary as the sun's warmth. The voice in the forest had spoken the truth. She was the keeper of balance. Not of just the shadows or the light, but of the spaces in between, those moments where the two forces met and intertwined. It was in these spaces that the world thrived, where growth happened, where life found its way. She could feel the rhythm of the forest now, its pulse steady and sure, echoing the calm beat of her own heart. It was no longer a matter of holding the darkness at bay or pushing the light away when it felt overwhelming. The dance between them was fluid, natural, an eternal ebb and flow that Capricorn was now a part of, no longer separate from. She had learned to embrace both. Her gaze drifted up to the sky, the last of the twilight stars beginning to appear in the dusky sky. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the quiet beauty of the world around her. The balance was not something she would ever fully master. It was a constant, shifting force, forever changing with each passing moment. But that was the beauty of it. It was never meant to be controlled. It was meant to be lived with, understood, and embraced. Capricorn smiled softly to herself, a feeling of peace settling over her. She had found her place, her purpose, not in the domination of the forces of light and dark, but in the quiet understanding that she was a part of something much greater, a never-ending dance of forces, both seen and unseen, all contributing to the ever-turning wheel of life. As the shadows lengthened and the night settled over the forest, Capricorn took a deep breath, knowing the journey was far from over. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she was ready to face them with the balance she had come to understand, with the shadows at her side and the light in her heart. And as she stepped forward into the night, the forest seemed to embrace her, welcoming her as its true keeper. The balance was hers to protect, and in that quiet moment, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.